Да надо, надо. Да. Карахан. Фиолетовый. Что это здесь? Фиолетовый. Что это здесь? Кто спорит? Нет, ни денег нет, друзей, ну, так, виртуально, терял уже совершенно. Не суть разговора. И че, какая власть у меня? Здесь вообще мудак какой-то непонятный. Ужас какой-то. Кто спорит? Нет, ни денег нет, друзей, ну, так, виртуально, терял уже всех. Не суть разговора. Почему так? Че, какая власть у меня? Здесь вообще мудак какой-то непонятный. Ужас какой-то. Кто спорит? Ни денег нет, друзей, ну, так, терял уже всех. Почему так? Отвратительно, да.
Я знаю по опыту, все, кто начинает работать с картами Таро, сталкиваются практически с одним и тем же набором проблем. Вы решили заняться картами, но не знаете, какую колоду.
When Final Fantasy Tactics was released in 1997, fans and critics alike were blown away by its rich narrative, which featured intricate relationships between the various characters. They were also impressed by its presentation, which featured a score composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto as opposed to Nobuo Uematsu, and its detailed and fluid gameplay mechanics, which operated at 60 frames per second despite using CD-ROMs, which were notorious for their slow read rates. By all accounts, the concept Hironobu Sakaguchi had come up with when working on Final Fantasy VI had not just been delivered upon, it had exceeded expectations. And what made the feat even more impressive was that Yasumi Matsuno, Hiroyuki Ito, and the rest of the development team had achieved this by building on only some of the concepts Sakaguchi had entrusted to them. What made the feat even more impressive was that Yasumi Matsuno, Hiroyuki Ito, and the rest of the development team had achieved this by building on only some of the concepts Sakaguchi had entrusted to them, as in truth, much of the game ended up being quite different from what Sakaguchi had envisioned, a result of Matsuno and Ito choosing to follow their own path and being allowed to do so. With hindsight, it was the correct decision on both accounts, but when looking back at the variables in play at the time, it was also a very bold decision. After creating Ogre Battle while still working at Quest, Matsuno had enhanced his reputation by creating Tactics Ogre, a game that helped to define elements that would become fundamental within the tactical role-playing genre. Even though everything, from the outside at least, was going well for Matsuno at Quest, as the two Ogre Battle games had been huge critical and commercial successes, he ended up joining Square because there existed the prospect of working with Sakaguchi, who at the time was one of his idols. That Matsuno decided to throw away many of the concepts handed to him by the person he idolized spoke volumes for how driven, confident and methodical he was as a storyteller and director. But it's also telling that Sakaguchi allowed him to do so, despite Matsuno being a fresh face at the company. It's quite well known that as part of the process, Matsuno created huge relational diagrams that connected each of the characters together, a version of which has been recreated by a content creator called Orange Fluffy Sheep. This kind of approach was not uncommon at the time, but what was uncommon... It's quite well known that as part of the process, Matsuno created huge relational diagrams that connected each of the characters together, a version of which has been recreated by a content creator called Orange Fluffy Sheep. This kind of approach was not uncommon at the time, but what was uncommon was the level of depth Matsuno had gone to, and it resonated with Sakaguchi. Going far beyond just establishing simple relationships such as friend or sibling, Matsuno instead went much deeper, highlighting specific emotions the characters would feel towards each other and how they might respond to each other during social encounters. Matsuno also chose to deviate away from the typical themes present within Final Fantasy games that had been released up until that point, as instead of creating a scenario that had its primary focus on a group of humans fighting against monsters or other supernatural beings, Tactics would introduce conflicts that existed between the various factions, and there would even be scenes included that saw humans killing other humans. These factors enabled Tactics to do something unprecedented, deviate away from the typical formula seen within the main number games to not just establish a foothold within the tactical role-playing game subgenre, but to build upon what was achieved by Tactics Ogre to become a best-in-class game that would lay down the blueprint for other games to follow. This not only proved that Sakaguchi was correct to try and merge Final Fantasy with complementary genres, something that led to further experimentation with games like Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon and Final Fantasy XI that blended Final Fantasy with the roguelite and MMO genres, but due to the way Matsuno worked, it also provided a solid framework for future properties related to Final Fantasy Tactics to exist, especially as this approach had already been evidenced by his previous works. Even though Matsuno left Quest before it was seen through, plans were already laid out for significant portions of what would become known as the Ogre Battle Saga, a huge franchise. Even though Matsuno left Quest before it was seen through, plans his previous works. Even though Matsuno left Quest before it was seen through, plans were already laid out for significant portions of what would become known as the Ogre Battle Saga, a huge franchise that would have its story told out of sequence, much like Star Wars. It meant that despite releasing as the first and second games in the series, Ogre Battle, The March of the Black Queen, and Tactics Ogre would serve as the 5th and 7th chapters in the overarching story, with Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber, releasing as the 6th chapter, based on plans laid out by Matsuno prior to his departure for Square. When working on Tactics, even though there was never any promise of Square granting the green light for a sequel or any other related property, it didn't stop Matsuno from taking a similarly expansive approach when working on the game, and by working with Ito, it saw the creation of an entire world that would become known as Ivalice. Never before had such depth been applied to the lore of a Final Fantasy game, and this was perhaps because they were always designed to be self-contained entities. Their worlds were almost always unnamed in the initial sense, with some retconned in later on, and the various factions that existed would be limited in scope, with the conflicts that existed feeling superficial, only there for plot progression, as opposed to something more deep-rooted that would help to create history and substance. NPCs were also created in a similar fashion, with very few having backstories of note that extended beyond the small segments of the narrative they were required for. History and substance. NPCs were also created in a similar fashion, with very few having backstories of note that extended beyond the small segments of the narrative they were required for. Ivalice was designed to be different, and this difference was noted by Sakaguchi. Up until that point, Sakaguchi had adopted a pretty strict policy when it came to the Final Fantasy franchise. Each entry would be standalone. There would be no sequels and no spin-offs based on existing lore, at least in video game format. Expansions would instead take place through the production of supporting materials, with prominent examples being Final Fantasy II Labyrinth of Nightmare and Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. The former being a novel written by Kenji Terada that rewrote the story of Final Fantasy II, making some pretty significant changes along the way, and the latter being an OVA that served as a follow-up to Final Fantasy V. But due to what had been created with Ivalice, Sakaguchi sought to take advantage of the wealth of material created by Matsuno Ito and the wider development team, and he would do so by expanding the world further through the production of a sequel, which would be given the provisional name of Final Fantasy Tactics II. With hindsight, it seems like a logical decision, and now, some 24 years after Tactics released, there are those who would be desperate for a follow-up, but at the time, it was a huge departure from the standard approach, and it led to some issues, first of which was staff availability. There was an appreciation that any follow-up would need to be released pretty soon after so that they could strike while the iron was hot, but neither of the two main creative forces were available, and neither were their teams. Matsuno had always been keen to explore new experiences, and even the original Ogre Battle games were in very different genres. This desire had not just evaporated since joining Square, and as a reward for the success of Final Fantasy Tactics, Matsuno was granted his wish to create an original title that would become known as Vagrant Story. Hiroyuki Ito had also been assigned to a new project, which would become known as Final Fantasy IX, and it meant that not only would neither of them be available to oversee Tactics II, very few of the resources who helped to make the original game would be available to work on the sequel.
Ну смотри, если бы я сейчас что-то делал, думаешь, у меня нормально будет, что-то вышло? Если бы я сейчас куда-то устраивался, ну да. Ну то есть, ну и что? Где моя, то есть, не знаю, понимаю. Ну работать параллельно, типа, теоретиком и это самое. Нет, мне музыкально нужна, то есть я специально, да, музыкальная среда, да, ну, возможно. Вот. Ну, мне нужно, если у меня есть опции, а зачем мне сворачивать туда с пути, у меня единственная, то есть, как бы, что значит заехать? Нет, смотри, если ты не будешь целыми днями играть на инструменте, ну да, то есть, ну, точно так же, если ты не будешь целый день танцевать, целыми днями танцевать, когда тебе за 30, то ты уже никогда не, то есть, собственно, у тебя план-то какой-то, Миша. Ну, просто понял, да? Ну, это имел в виду, да. Ну, это имел в виду, да. Он себе так думает, конечно. Ну, это есть он сам. Ну, он просто не знаю. Ты и так всю жизнь будешь работать. А зачем тебе не работать, если у тебя даже такая возможность есть? То есть, ну, по идее, нету такой опции. Ну, второй такой. А, пенсия, все дела. Ты серьезно? Ну, серьезно, зачем? Так это и есть работа же, она есть как бы. Ладно, что делать, потому надо не наоборот, ну ты серьезно? Не знаю, короче, да, можно. Ну, не знаю. Ну, отдыхайте тогда. То есть просто, ну, ты серьезно, то есть как бы что, ну вот это, да, вот я понял. Ну, это имеет в виду. Штарк, когда он просто это не думает. Жестоко, ну, может не всегда так. Может надо очень хорошо делать. Может, может, а может. Может, да, не знаю. Сходит, ну, да. А, ну вот это и есть он самое. Ну это и есть он. Ну типа того. Короче, работа как, он тебя понял, то есть, да. Ну, а когда он говорил? Наоборот, значит, да.
As such, Sakaguchi decided to helm the project himself, and so it could be delivered in parallel to both Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy IX, and still released on the PlayStation, he sought out an external partner to assist with development. Due to the restrictions placed around the project, it was decided that instead of building upon the visual style created for the original game, focus would instead be placed around streamlining asset production, and this led to wholesale changes being made. It would see a much heavier focus placed on the production of 2D assets, and it led to the isometric system from the previous game being completely canned, with a 2D hexagonal grid system developed in its stead. Jobs would still have a prominent part in the game, but based on what we know, there would have been a focus placed around confrontations between individual characters in addition to larger conflicts. But as with so many projects, development on Final Fantasy Tactics II didn't ever get that far, and this was for numerous reasons. When speaking to Nico a few years ago when he was appearing to play through the original Final Fantasy Tactics, Matsuno revealed that the project first started to encounter difficulties due to how busy Sakaguchi ended up becoming, perhaps because he was also attempting to help out with Final Fantasy IX, as well as laying down the groundwork for Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. It led to Sakaguchi asking Matsuno to take charge of Final Fantasy Tactics II alongside his work on Vagrant Story, and this ended up being quite difficult to manage, not least because he would now be directing two teams, one who he was comfortable working with, and one who were completely new to him. With split focus and numerous issues happening behind the scenes, working on both games became just too difficult to manage, and although he didn't get into specifics on the livestream, Matsuno did reveal that Tactics 2 ended up being cancelled for numerous reasons, with there being no willingness to try and salvage the project, in its planned form at least. There's nothing to say that certain concepts were not repurposed though, and placed into other properties. This was a consistent theme with Matsuno and many of the other creators at Square and subsequently Square Enix. For example, Matsuno revealed not too long ago that he used a concept from the cancelled Vagrant Story 2 as the basis for a storyline in Final Fantasy XIV. And it's not like the entire Tactics franchise died after this decision either, as Matsuno oversaw the creation of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. This was then followed up by a few Evil East based games that Matsuno was not part of, and the sub-franchise has been dormant since Final Fantasy Tactics S, with the raids in Final Fantasy XIV being so well received. That he used a concept from the cancelled Vagrant Story 2 as the basis for a story, and many of the other creators at Square and subsequently Square Enix. For example, Matsuno revealed not too long ago that he used a concept from the cancelled Vagrant Story 2 as the basis for a storyline in Final Fantasy XIV. And it's not like the entire Tactics franchise died after this decision either, as Matsuno oversaw the creation of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. This was then followed up by a few Evil East based games that Matsuno was not part of, and the sub-franchise has been dormant since Final Fantasy Evil East based games that Matsuno was not part of, and the sub franchise has been dormant since Final Fantasy Tactics S, but with the raids in Final Fantasy XIV being so well received, who knows what will happen in the future. And on that note, are you still holding out for hope that Final Fantasy Tactics 2 may exist somewhere down the line as either a game or some other kind of material, and would you support a revival of the Tactics brand? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this brief look into the situation surrounding why Tactics 2 was never made, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to apologise for my bad voice, I've unfortunately got a cold, but I'd like to extend a thank you for everyone for putting up with it and listening all the way through if you're here. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super...
Как зарабатывать 100 тысяч рублей на Wildberries, сидя дома и продавая там товары?
Я не могу сказать, но мне это было бы не очень интересно. Ну, смотри сам. Ну, здорово. Уметь что-то интересно. Знать что-то все равно ты будешь по-любому. Ну, понимаю. Ну, как дела? Ну, работать надо просто. Ну, смотря, что ты имеешь в виду. Можно что угодно. Истории сосисок разбираться, еще там, лук, там, еще что-нибудь. Тем более, что это особо несложно сейчас, если кому что надо, можно сейчас в интернете надо. Ну, это понятно, что. Он просто это имеет в виду, да. Ну, и что дальше? Уметь надо делать там, пожалуйста.
Приходи на мой бесплатный вебинар, где я расскажу, как это сделать. Чтобы принять участие, жми синюю кнопку «Участвуй», и я расскажу, какие товары стоит продавать в 2021 году, как это сделать и как не допустить ключевых ошибок. Меня зовут Марина Полетаева, я вышла на Wildberries с нуля до первого.
RPGs would be nothing without The copious amounts of equipment that can be acquired throughout each quest. Some pieces can be found, others purchased, and yet others still acquired after performing great feats. And the collection of such equipment can often be one of the most important factors in determining not just the relative strength of a party, but also whether they will be able to overcome what challenges lay in wait. Weapons are a crucial component of this, and in relation to Final Fantasy, when looking at the entire breadth of games available, there have literally been thousands of different weapons introduced across a plethora of categories. From swords through to axes, wands, and even some of the more unorthodox weapons like boomerangs and bells, each category has featured weapons of incredible power. but some have broken the confines of their initial appearance, becoming recurring weapons that have gained legendary status due to their application or association with certain characters. And it's those weapons that we're going to be taking a look at today, as after another hard-fought vote, our Patreon supporters suggested that we produce a video where we take a detailed look at 7 weapons that, since their introduction, have gone on to become legendary. And we're going to kick things off with the Masamune. The concept of ultimate weapons was introduced in Final Fantasy I, and one of the 2 weapons that could be considered an ultimate weapon was the Masamune. Appearing alongside Excalibur, the Masamune was defined as a legendary katana without peer, and it could be found hidden deep within the Chaos Shrine. Outside of its attack power, accuracy and critical hit chance, what separated the Masamune from all the other weapons featured in Final Fantasy I was that it could be equipped by any job, making it very useful for turning even white mages into huge physical damage dealers. The role of the Masamune was then similar in Final Fantasy II, as it again appeared as the de facto ultimate weapon, but in the games that followed, even though it was still put on a pedestal from a narrative perspective, its relative power started to diminish. In Final Fantasy III, the Masamune appeared as one of the weapons that could be found in Eureka, and in Final Fantasy V it was one of the sealed weapons, but in neither game was it considered to be an ultimate weapon, and a new weapon called Ragnarok often appeared as its superior. This was also the case in Final Fantasy IV, where Masamune appeared as Edge's ultimate weapon, but it was relatively quite weak in comparison to Ragnarok, Cecil's ultimate weapon. Final Fantasy VI then took things a bit further, relegating the Masamune to a mid-tier weapon for Cyan. But all would be forgiven with its appearance in Final Fantasy VII, which is where its legendary status was cemented. Even though Masamune was not a weapon obtainable by the player, it appeared as the signature weapon of Sephiroth, the game's main antagonist. Modelled after an Adachi blade, the sword was ridiculously long, and the developers made sure to emphasise its strength and importance, including it in pivotal moments of the experience. Perhaps due to its levels of prominence, the Masamune did not feature in Final Fantasy VIII, and although it did appear in Final Fantasy IX, it did so as a thief's sword that was interestingly overshadowed by Ultimate Weapon, Cloud's ultimate weapon. But after
If you want to restore your perfect vision, with something that has never been done before, in record time and for the rest of your life, then you need to see this. Harvard scientists confirmed for the first time ever that vision problems are not caused by genetics or aging, but by dangerous microbiomes that actually suffocate your eyes, and which increase the risk of blindness by over 97%.
But after that, it was Auron's celestial weapon, the Empyrean weapon for samurais in Final Fantasy XI, and the ultimate katana in the original version of Final Fantasy XII. Since then though, the appearance of the Masamune has been somewhat diminished. Final Fantasy XIII did not feature the weapon at all, although it did later appear in Lightning Returns, and in Final Fantasy XV it was available as a pre-order bonus that was quite weak in comparison to other weapons available to Noctis. It has also not yet appeared in Final Fantasy XIV, which is quite surprising, but who knows what will happen in the future. Even still, due to the prominence of Sephiroth, the Masamune stands as one of the most iconic weapons to have ever appeared in the franchise, and its many other appearances, even when it has been the strongest weapon in the game, ended up being eclipsed. Even though the Masamune was the ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy I and II, it would soon be superseded by a weapon that was introduced in Final Fantasy III, although the process was not immediate. Ragnarok first appeared alongside Masamune as one of the weapons available in Eureka, but it was more powerful, offering more attack and a +5 boost to all stats, as opposed to the Masamune, which only boosted agility. The difference became more pronounced in Final Fantasy IV, as Ragnarok appeared as not only the ultimate weapon for Cecil, but in terms of its raw strength, it was also the most powerful weapon in the game. Not only did it have the highest base attack, but it also boosted stats and provided an elemental affinity. Ragnarok then broke away from the Masamune in Final Fantasy V to become something special. The 2 previous games had seen Ragnarok and Masamune fit within the same classification, with Ragnarok being a stronger alternative due to its class and character associations. But in Final Fantasy V, whereas Masamune was a sealed weapon, Ragnarok was the reward for beating Shinryu, and it was not only the strongest sword, but also the strongest weapon in the game. Final Fantasy VI saw the divide further, as Ragnarok was the most powerful weapon that could be obtained through conventional means, eclipsing
Вот это и есть. Ну да, пожалуйста. Какая вот она сидит. До этого, да. А, ну вот это. Ладно, да. Да, жестко пока. Жестко себе. Пока не допускаю. Ну наоборот, это. Ну наоборот, да. Ну, пока, ну, вот поэтому, да. Слушай, так холодно рассказал.
Mune, but it was still less powerful than the Lightbringer and Ultima weapon. From that point onward, Ragnarok would often be there or thereabouts in terms of power. It was a strong sword for Cloud in Final Fantasy VII, as well as for Knights in Tactics, and for most people, it would have been the strongest weapon available for Steiner in Final Fantasy IX. Ragnarok also appeared as a relic weapon in Final Fantasy XI and a Zodiac weapon in Final Fantasy XIV. But even though its importance was diminished in other numbered games like Final Fantasy X and XII, its importance in Final Fantasy IV, VI, XI and XIV, as well as its enduring nature as a top-tier weapon in many other games, has cemented the legacy of Ragnarok. Our next weapon also doubles up as one of the most famous abilities in the franchise, and both are often associated with Odin. The Zantetsuken ability first appeared in Final Fantasy III, and it was used by Odin to bring about instant death to all susceptible enemies. It appeared again in Final Fantasy IV and V, as well as VI, and each time it did so as a powerful move associated with the summonable entity. Final Fantasy VI, however, also had an obtainable weapon called Zantetsuken, and there were two possible sources for this acquisition. One required the Blue Dragon to be defeated, and the other involved betting the Lightbringer at the Colosseum. Although its power wasn't as good as some of the other available weapons, Zantetsuken did have some useful secondary benefits. It would allow the wielder to use the Bushido and Runic commands, and there was also a 25% chance of it insta-killing its target, even affecting the undead. Zantetsuken would next appear as an obtainable weapon in Final Fantasy XI as a reward for those who defeated Odin Prime. There was also another version available called Zantetsuken X. The initial weapon was a sword with a whole host of stat boosts, including the Death Status effect, and it could be equipped by warriors, Dark Knights and Blue Mages. The X variant was then a great sword equipable by Paladins, Dark Knights and Rune Fencers, but it didn't have the additional death effect. As it was instead replaced with the ability for the weapon to sometimes nullify an enemy's defense.
Quels sont les métiers les mieux payés sur Terre? Médecins, avocats ou encore chimistes, ces personnes touchent en moyenne un salaire de 7000 € par mois. Ils ont
Final Fantasy XIV has also featured an iteration of Zantetsuken that could be obtained as a reward for defeating Odin, but it was nowhere near as strong as the version seen in Final Fantasy XI. Perhaps the most noticeable occurrence of a playable character wielding Zantetsuken came in Final Fantasy XIII, a game that did not feature either the Masamune or the Ragnarok. When Odin was summoned and subsequently entered into its Gestalt mode, Lightning would wield the legendary sword. But even still, Zantetsuken has become legendary in its own right purely because of its long-standing association with Odin, an incredibly powerful summon that's featured in many, many games over the years. Ultimate Weapon first appeared in Final Fantasy VI alongside the Lightbringer as one of the two ultimate weapons that supplanted Ragnarok, and it was quite unique. It could be found in the Cave of the Sealed Gate, was equipable by Terra, Locke, Edge and Celes, and even had its own backstory. It was said that the Ultimate Weapon was forged during the War of the Magi as a magical weapon that would reflect the power of the one who wielded it, and that then played out into its damage output. Ultimate Weapon had 255 attack power, but its damage output was based on the level of the character equipping the weapon. Attack power, but its damage output was based on the level of the character equipping the weapon, as well as comparing the current HP to their maximum HP. Ultimate Weapon also had a sprite that would then reflect the potential damage output, with the blade's length decreasing as potential damage also decreased. Ultimate Weapon then retained its position as an ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy VII, as it appeared as the most powerful weapon that Cloud could wield, and its damage was again based on current HP against maximum HP, with Ultimate Weapon at its optimal damage output when Cloud was at maximum health. As in the previous game, the weapon's visual style changed to represent potential damage, but this time it was denoted by the colour of the blade as opposed to its length. Ultimate Weapon was not obtainable in time it was denoted by the colour of the blade as opposed to its length. Ultimate Weapon was not obtainable in Final Fantasy VIII, although it was wielded by Ultimate Weapon, but its status as an ultimate weapon was retained in Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X. Not only was it the most powerful weapon available to Zidane, but it was also Tidus' celestial weapon in the Japanese version, as well as the Italian, French, Spanish and German versions. But for some reason, in the English version it was changed from Ultimate Weapon to Kaladbolg. Ultimate Weapon did not appear in Final Fantasy XI or XII, and it has yet to appear in Final Fantasy XIV, but it did appear in Revenant Wings as Vaughn's ultimate weapon outside of the Anastasia. This retained its prominent status, but that status was then diminished in Final Fantasy XIII as Ultimate Weapon was superseded by its superboss big brother, Omega Weapon. Both were weapons available for Lightning to wield, but Ultimate Weapon was the weapon that needed to be transmuted in order to create Omega Weapon, Lightning's ultimate weapon. As a complete aside here, perhaps due to its prominence in Final Fantasy VI, VII and X, where Nomura was a prominent part of the creative team, Ultimate Weapon is often the strongest keyblade available to protagonists in the Kingdom Hearts franchise, and this trend continued in Kingdom Hearts 3. Save the Queen gained significant status due to its appearance in Final Fantasy IX, but what's interesting is that unlike many of the other weapons we've featured so far, it first appeared outside of the numbered series. Final Fantasy Tactics featured an expanded roster of jobs, and it meant that alongside the regular Knight and Dark Knight, there were also Holy Knights, Templars, Sword Saints and Divine Knights. Each was able to equip Knight Swords, and one of them, which could be found in Midlight Steam, was called Save the Queen. It was quite weak in comparison to other swords in the same category, like Excalibur and Ragnarok, but Save the Queen was useful as it granted auto-protection to the wielder. Save the Queen next appeared in Final Fantasy VIII, but it was no longer a sword. Instead, it was a whip, and it served as Quistis' ultimate weapon. Given that Hiroyuki Ito was a prominent member of the team that worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, it made sense that Save the Queen next appeared in Final Fantasy IX, a game he was directing. And here, it retained its association with Holy Knights, as it was the weapon of choice of Beatrix, a notable paladin who was formidable in combat. Even though its base attack power was quite weak, Save the Queen featured a unique algorithm that based its damage output on character level, and if Beatrix was above level 85, it would make Save the Queen one of the strongest weapons in the game. After Final Fantasy IX, outside of Final Fantasy X, where it appeared as either a decent sword for Tidus or a rod for Yuna, depending on which localization you were playing, Save the Queen has continued to appear as a weapon associated almost exclusively with paladins and knights. Final Fantasy XII featured it as a great sword, and its relative strength was similar to what was seen in Tactics, and it also appeared in Revenant Wings as an exclusive sword for Barsh. Its appearance in Final Fantasy XIII echoed Final Fantasy VIII, as Save the Queen was the ultimate weapon for Snow, who was associated with the Sentinel role, but it was no longer a sword. Final Fantasy XIV then took things to another level, as although it wasn't obtainable as a weapon, Save the Queen was an important weapon in the context of the story, and it has featured in Shadowbringers as an optional storyline. The penultimate weapon on our list, the revolver, became iconic following its initial appearance in Final Fantasy VIII, as it was the weapon associated with Squall Leonhart. Within the lore of Final Fantasy VIII, few are able to master the revolver's overriding gunblade weapon class due to its dual application, and we got to understand why once players got to use Squall and Cypher in combat, as the dual application manifested through an interactive gameplay mechanic. This allowed the gun to be fired after the blade had swiped, something that meant both characters could never miss, even if blinded. What's interesting is that unlike many of the other weapons on this list, Revolver was Squall's weakest weapon. But due to its visual style and prominence within various cutscenes, including the awe-inspiring opening sequence, it has persisted in popular culture much longer than Squall's ultimate weapon, Lionheart. Following the release of Final Fantasy VIII, it has been difficult for creators to replicate the weapon, as its design was so cemented in people's minds. They created variants of Gunblade, such as the Velvet Nightmare, a weapon used by Yazoo and Loz, as well as Vice's rifle katanas, but no creator has been brave enough to try and reinvent the revolver. The closest we've got, outside of the special ceremonial item that came as part of the Shadowbringers Collector's Edition, was one of Balthier's guns, called the Ras Algethi, but that was only close in visual design, not naming convention. And that brings us on to the final entry in our list, the Buster Sword, which serves as a nice counterbalance to our first weapon in this video, the Masamune. Much like the Gunblade, the Buster Sword has such an iconic association with Cloud Strife that it's been difficult for it to appear anywhere as anything other than a tribute. It was also the weakest sword available for Cloud to use, but its legendary status has really been connected to the lore of Final Fantasy VII, something that was expanded upon in significant fashion following the release of Crisis Core. Here we learned that the original owner of the Buster Sword was Angeal Hewley, who passed it down to Zack Fair as a symbol of his honour and dreams. Zack then passed the sword down to Cloud in a similar manner. Both Angeal and Zack used the Buster Sword exclusively, serving as evidence for its power, and it's helped to add to its legendary status, which was already established following that initial appearance. Outside of Final Fantasy VII, the Buster Sword has appeared in a few games, but they have always paid tribute to the original version. Tactics Advance and its sequel, for example, had it as an equipable weapon for those using the Soldier class, as well as similar classes like Warrior and Dragoon, and Lightning Returns had it appear as a piece of downloadable content. It has also appeared in Final Fantasy XIV as part of the Braver and Blade Dance limit breaks, but like the Revolver, no creator has been brave enough to try and reinvent the Buster Sword, and it's doubtful that any ever will. But yeah, with that, I think we're done. They were 7 weapons that after their initial appearance have gone on to become legendary. Let us know in the comments below which weapon you feel is the most legendary and iconic, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to accept...
Смотри, что ты смотришь по телевизору? Кто тебе сказал, что это говно вообще можно смотреть? Почему бы тебе не поиграть в игру, например? Как пример тебе говорю. Наоборот просто. Ну, он тебя просто запомнил. Я просто так, ну, он понимает тебя просто. Я просто себе не говорю. Ну нет. У меня вот на телевизор, я не буду тут ничего, тут это не хорошо, не плохо, просто, как это сказать, да? Не то что аллергия, а как-то. У меня смутные чувства, когда я смотрю телевизор, у меня как бы, да. Не то, что я теряю время, типа, ну, как бы, как помойка, что ли. Ну, не знаю, не без всяких красивых, я просто, да. Ну, короче говоря, что, да, то есть это не то, на что можно тратить время, как бы, да. Да, понимаете. В своей единственной жизни, да, понимаете. Да, понимаете. Да, особенно мужчине. Насчет женщины я не знаю, а если у нее нормально все, я не знаю, там. Ну, то есть, типа, ну, она имеет в виду наоборот, только если у тебя все время с похмелья голова болит, да. Да, понимаю. Что практически у большой массы, наверное, судя по тому, что, ну, наверное, это не суть разговора. Я тоже по себе помню, что когда такой, как бы, да, в твоей единственной жизни еще раз. Да, понимаю, а чтобы выйти из похмельного синдрома, лично я, это моя засечка, да, я понял. Да. То есть, ну, я тебе ничего не навязываюсь, просто я тебе говорю, как бы, что, ну, а может и нет, тебе, ну, наоборот, значит, ну, я просто о себе говорю, да, наоборот, да. Аттракции, да. Народные, с ютубом так иногда тоже, ну, не всегда, не иногда вообще. маленький, ты ничего не можешь произвести, понимаешь? И тебе кажется, что все, понимаешь, что все вообще можно, что все производится тобой, да. Там за себя находится. как своя привычка. Всё, правильно? Да. Всё. Да, это не